Hey, comrades, what's up? So I'm going to go through the new adventure that we're going to engage in is the Highlander series. Yes, the Highlander. So we're going to go through all 7 movies, I think, 6 or 7. I can't remember. I think there's a newer one that came out that I never saw. And then the TV shows, and there's multiple, including an animated series that takes place in the future. I love it. If you know what the Highlander is, it's fucking fantastic. It is a movie from, I think, the early 80s. I can't remember exactly when it came out. But I watched all this shit when I was like a teenager, and it was amazing. And there's this there's this tabletop role playing game called Immortal, which is like loosely based on the stuff in Highlander. But the whole core concept behind the Highlander is that they're immortals. So humans sometimes when they die, they're actually immortals, and that the only way to kill them is to cut off their head. And if their heads are cut off by another immortal, then they gain like their power through like bad lightning CG. So good. And this show is just like hyper masculine. It's just dudes fighting with fucking swords, a lot of action, car chases. This is like the movie and the TV shows and whatnot, and then just like banging hot chicks, and it is so good. So we're gonna do this in chronological order for when stuff takes place within the world. So they made Highlander, and then they made Highlander 2, and the Highlander 1 takes place in like the 80s, and then Highlander 2 takes place in like the far distant future. So it's actually like the last movie, if I recall correctly. And then there's like an animated series that takes place even further along than that, and it deals with this whole thing where like the Immortals are like, well, I don't want to spoil it for you here, but. It's a lot of bizarre stuff. Anyway, so we'll start the first movie, Highlander. The movie starts off, we're at a pro wrestling match. We get some sweet Queen music. Queen is heavily involved in the Highlander series generally, and especially here at the beginning. So, and then we see a crowd. They're going crazy. We see some of the wrestling match. It's super badass. Like I said, hyper masculinity all around with this stuff. And then we get a guy who's sitting like, he looks very concerned, and he's got like kind of like a duster on, and he's just kind of like, And he ends up like leaving the match and going out to this garage nearby, and there he runs into like this guy in like a black suit with glasses, and he's carrying a fucking sword. Because of course he is, because the show's fucking badass. And then our guy that we followed from the wrestling match, he also pulls out a sword. He pulls out a katana. And then we get a fucking sword fight in this garage, and they're like breaking water pipes, and there's like steam going up, and there's just like crashing into stuff and rolling over cars. And our guy gets his sword knocked out of his hand, and so he like hits something to cause like more smoke, and then he like dives down into the cars, and he's running, and he eventually gets his katana, and then they have their final face off, and he ends up disarming the black suited guy and cutting off his fucking head. Hell yeah. And then he's like, you start hearing police sirens, and like there's like an alarm going off, and he's like, all right. So then he kind of kicks the sword like underneath another car away from the body, and then he takes his sword and like throws it on top of like up in the roof of the parking garage so that no one can find it, and then he jets out of there. And then while this is going on, and even while he's in the wrestling match, we get a lot of like flashbacks. We don't quite understand that they're flashbacks yet. We just see these images of like Scottish warriors fighting in the Highlands of Scotland, obviously. And then here we skip to that part, and we see the same guy who we met, and he's a MacLeod. He's part of Clan MacLeod in Scotland, and the MacLeods are going to war, and he's got beautiful long hair instead of like a normal 80s haircut. So good. And so he's like jaw jacking with some of his friends, and there's some like bosomed big bosomed blonde lady who runs up and gives him flowers, talks about they're gonna bang later, and he's like, hell yeah. And his cousin, who's also MacLeod, is like, fuck yeah, brother. And so then they go to war, and then we skip back over to we don't know his name yet. So we skip back over to MacLeod in like the present, and he's racing in this like awesome fucking like James Bond style like convertible car, and he gets pulled over to the police, and they treat him badly, and he kind of fights back a little bit, and then they drag him off, and then we go back to Clan MacLeod, and this guy gets identified as being Connor, and Connor MacLeod goes to this battle, and then we see this crazy looking dude with this like fucking badass like fantasy like what's it fucking called? Like Skyrim dragon armor riding a horse. And he's like, there's a boy named Connor out there. He's mine. That's the deal. And then this other clan that's like fighting the Clan MacLeod is like, oh yeah, let's do it. And so then there's a battle, but no one's fighting Connor. And then eventually the guy with the badass armor like rolls up, and he stabs Connor in the stomach, and he's like, there can be only one. And then like the cousin comes up and hits him, and then they're able to like rescue Connor. And you're like, and then we go back to the present, and Connor he's in the jail, and he's being interrogated, and he calls some dude a fag. He's trying. I'm not saying that. That's literally what he said. Oh, God bless you, the '80s. So, they talk about sucking dick, and then the police officer he called a fag like attacks him, and so he fights back, and then it gets broken up, and then the detective's like, "Shit, man," and then Connor's like, "Am I under arrest?" And they're like, "No," and he's like, "Deuces," and he just walks the fuck out there, and like all these like criminals and like other people watching this go on from like the other room because they're interrogating him just like in an office with a huge open window. They're all clapping and cheering. Fuck yeah. At this point, we switch over to our little Russian friend. He goes by like Vlad Kruger or some crazy nonsense, or Claude, I don't remember. Anyway, he writes his name down. He shows up in a hotel and he's got this badass case with like a sword he puts together. And I'm like, bro, it's like the 1980s. The fuck? Why do you have your sword in like a sniper rifle case? And then this like hot prostitute comes in to his hotel room. I love this movie so much. I can't get over it. It's so fucking awesome. Oh man. I'm getting a stitch. Anyway, we get introduced around here to what's her name? Some lady who's like a metallurgist or whatever. She's an expert at like metals and ancient swords and crap and whatever. And she's part of the forensic team that's investigating the death of this guy in the parking garage. And she's the one who finds the discarded sword that's here. And then she later comes back and like finds some metal clippings and like, or she uses like, okay, let's break it up. So she does that, and then she goes back. She's like investigating it, the sword and like some other stuff, and she gets like some metal samplings from like the dead immortal, right? And so then she comes back with like a metal detector and finds more traces of like this metal like in the concrete wall that got hit when Connor cut off the guy's head and whatnot. It goes back and forth a lot. I'm just trying to remember off the top of my head the order. It's not that big of a deal. But it's around this point that... No, okay. And so then... she goes to like a bar where... Ow, I got like this crazy thing in my back. She goes to this bar where Connor's at, and he's kind of following her a little bit or whatnot, and he tries to talk to her while they're getting like drinks or whatever, and then she blows him off and then heads out. But when he leaves, she actually follows him, and he wanders over to like this construction area or whatever, and then he grabs her and tells her to be quiet because dun dun dun, Kruger's there, and then Kruger pops out and he's like, "Fuck you, McLeod, let's fight." Man. And so they start fighting, but Connor doesn't have a sword or anything, so he's fighting like a metal pipe and some other stuff, and they're going back and forth, and it's almost like a shonen anime battle. Just bam, 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 fight, and then all of a sudden this police chopper shows up for some reason and is like, "Hey, both of you, stand down!" And both of them like, both of them were like, "Oopsies!" And they both run off in different directions. And Kruger's like, "I'll get you next time, McLeod, I promise." And so he runs off, and then the girl chases after Connor, and is like something, and he's like, "You need to stay the fuck out of this, or you're gonna die," and blows her off. And then we go back in time. So Connor's, he's like risen from the dead. There was like a scene somewhere in there where he's like dead, and like the girl who wants to bang him is like crying and stuff. And then he just like rolls in, and everyone's like, "Oh, hey, something." And then his cousin, who was like his best friend forever, is like, "You're a witch." And he's like, "Why? I'm fine. Why can't we be friends still?" and whatnot. And so then they take him out, and they're like beating him, and they have him like in a stockade almost, like this crazy. It's like he's wearing it instead of being like bent over, and they're hitting him and kicking him and throwing stuff at him, and they're all mad. And then there's this one guy, like the lady's dad or like one of his other cousins or whatever. It's not his cousin, because his cousin like turned on him like hardcore, like because he's an asshole. But this other blonde guy who seems related to the lady that he was supposed to hook up with is like, he like does him a favor and banishes him instead of having him be like killed because he's a witch or whatever, because of like Christianity and some crazy bullshit like that. Anyway, we then skip ahead a little bit into the future there in the past, and he's like living in some sort of like castle which is him and this like hot other blonde lady, and he's like a blacksmith or something, and they're like flirting, and then they fuck, and we get to see a little bit of that. Nothing too crazy, right? And then this like red mage from Final Fantasy game shows up, and it's Sean Connery, and I'm like, hell yes, I totally forgot this guy was in this movie. I don't know how I could forget, but that's what he looks like. He's wearing this like crazy red thing, and he's riding like a horse, and he's like, "Hello, I'm from Spain. My name is some crazy Spanish name." And then we go back to the present, and then we see McLeod like wander into his home, and we get a shot of him picking up a book, and it's a book by the forensic lady, and it's about metals, and he like laughs to himself. Like, okay. So then we go back to her, and she's like meeting with her boss or something about Connor or about like what's going on, and he's talking about like, oh, we're moving on from that case. The case isn't really that important, but she's like very interested in the whole thing, and she has like we see like an open file on her desk about Connor specifically, and he's going by like Nash in modern day or whatever. Anyway, we then skip back in time and we see like the red mage Sean Connery like rowing a boat out into a lake, and Connor's like, I hate water, I hate boats, what are we doing out here? And he's like, oh, something. And he's like, you Spaniards are ridiculous. He's like, whoever said I was a Spaniard? I'm Egyptian. He's like, you said you were from Spain. He's like, whatever, blah blah blah. And he's like training him. He's like, you must be trained in the quickening and all this stuff. And then they start to train on the boat, and immediately Connor falls into the water, of course. So our boy, the Red Wizard, knocks Connor into the water on the boat and then rows the fuck out of there. And Connor's like in the water, like freaking out. I can't swim, yada, yada, yada. And then the Red Wizard is like, don't worry about it. You're immortal. You'll be fine. And he is, of course, because this is a shonen battle anime, by the way. we haven't figured it out so far. We then get some like over talk about the quickening, which is like their jitsu magic that like they can access, what lets them feel like at one with the world and also be faster and stronger than mortals and whatnot. And then we get like an extensive training montage where they're just like fighting in like the Highlands of Scotland and like under waterfalls and shit. It's so good. This goes on for a minute. Like, not gonna lie, it goes on for a bit. It's pretty badass. So we just get them talking about stuff, feeling stuff, and then after the training montage, it ends with Connor knocking Red Wizard's sword off into like down a cliff, and then it's like time for the actual battle or something. And I was like, did you just knock like the battle test? And I was like, you just knocked the sword off a cliff, like the fuck. But the real test is now. And so they like fight in the woods for a little bit and talk about that. He teaches about like cutting the heads off, how like nothing can hurt them but cutting the heads off, and about sacred ground, how they can always hide out in sacred ground because of like tradition, because they're honorable people. These immortals, just like the Japaneses. God, so good. It's so funny. I love this shit so much. And then they're at like a fair, or they're just like some town with a bunch of like ragamuffins and people, and like Connor's girlfriend is like shopping, and they're flirting and stuff. And then Red Wizard's like, you should break up with her. And he's like, what? He's like, I want to have a family and shit. And he's like, you can't have a family. We're like, what's that word? Where they're sterile. Like immortals are sterile, they can't have kids. And he's like, oh, she won't mind. And then he like tells him the story. He's like, I've been alive for 2,500 fucking years. Like, jeez. And I've had 3 wives. And then he pulls out like this sweet ass fucking katana. And he's like, my last one was like, I don't know, some Japanese girl. Sakuki, I don't remember. Anyway, so his Japanese wife, and then her father was like Masamune, who's like the greatest like legendary swordsmith of all time, and he crafted this legendary katana, which is important. Like the show, so it's not just like a fucking badass show. It's written so well because this comes up later with the girl in the present, because she finds the katana and she's like, the fuck, the sword shouldn't exist, because she's like a meteorologist, right? She works for forensics for the police, but her specialty is in like meteorology. And she's like, oh, this sword is like the way it's made, the technique wasn't taken until like the Middle Ages or something, but like the sword is like way older than that, and the metal used is like way older, and like I need to know more information. And that's why she gets really into the whole Connor situation and gets pulled into his orbit. So it's just like peak writing. Anyway, and then Connor's like, no, I'm not gonna break up with her, and because the guy's like, oh, she broke my, when she died, it like broke my heart, and like I don't want you to have to go through that pain and whatnot. And he's like, I'll handle it. And then they talk about the Krugen, because they talk about the feeling, like it's the Red Wizard's like, when you first met me, you were like freaking out. And he's like, yeah. And he's like, that's how we know like other immortals are around. You ever feel that before? And he's like, yeah, there was this guy in this armor and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, all right, that's the Krugen. What's the Krugen? Krugen are these people in Russia that like threw babies off cliffs and shit. They're real evil. And this guy is an immortal Krugen, and he's like the most powerful of all the immortals in the world right now. And he's got like a dark heart. So if he ends up winning like the battle of like, there can be only one. He keeps saying that continuously, because apparently these immortals, there's some sort of game afoot where whoever's the last man standing gets like all the power, and essentially becomes like a god, because they're immortal and have like the quickening. And the quickening is more than just like this feeling. It's literally like superpowers. Like, this is a fucking like, you gotta watch this show and be like, I am watching a battle shonen anime, because you are. Because the more people you kill, they cut off their heads, you get their powers. So it's just like the powers stack on top of each other, and it's like speed and stuff. And we see an example of it earlier when he climbs back into out of the water, and he has a sword, and he's gonna go up and like stab the Red Wizard, and he just like disappears and is behind him, and he's like, holy shit, how'd you do that? And he's like, the quickening. And it's literally the quickening, right? Makes you fast and strong. Okay. So then what happens next? Oh, okay, so then we get Connor's like off fucking around or something. Who knows? But then his girlfriend and Red Wizard are just hanging out, and the Red Wizard's like being charming and shit and telling some body stories or whatever. And then the Krugen shows up and they're like, oh, and then they have like an anime shonen battle where they fight, and it goes on. It's so good. It's just like stabbing each other and going up and down, and the whole castle that Connor was standing in is like falling apart, and there's like lightning in the background, and the girl's like screaming. And there's all sorts of crazy shit with that, and he threatens to like rape her and stuff like that. And then it looks like a Red Wizard's got him, but in like the last minute, the guy like turns it around, the Krugen, and like stabs him, and then takes him to like the top of this cliff, and there's like lightning, and he cuts off his head, and then he absorbs like his powers, and he's like, Rrr! And then he gets like blasted off the tower by like the lightning as well. And the girl's like, oh my god, blah 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 blah. And the guy picks her up, and he's like, hey, your turn. And then we go back to the present, and in the present, Connor's like chilling, thinking about stuff. And then we see Rachel, I think is her name, the meteorologist lady. She's talking to Brenda, who is Connor's assistant managing his like antique salon. And they're having like a discussion, and then Connor, who's pretending to be Nash, he like wanders in, and then he starts talking to this lady, and essentially she wants to know about the sword, and he's like, I don't know anything about the sword, we don't deal in swords. She's like, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, well, are you good at cooking dinner? And I'm like, the balls on this fucking dude. Like, she comes asking a question, it's like, you make me dinner, I'll come over for a date, and then we'll talk about it. And she's like, you bet, big guy. And he's like, get out of here, toots. I'm not even fucking joking, that's literally what happens. I love it. It's so fucking good. And then she leaves, and then Brenda, the assistant, is like giving him some looks, and he's like, what? And she's like, you can't fool me, you got like this romantic notions. And then we go back to like World War II, it looks like, and he's running around in some just fucking like white shirt and like suspenders outfit, dodging tanks and shit. And then he finds this little girl in like this room, and the little girl is Brenda, right? And so he rescues her, and then he gets shot in the back by a German. And then the girl is like, how are you still alive, and why are you pretending to be dead? And he's like, shut up. And then the German guy comes up to like finish it off or check on what's going on, and he gets up and shoots the shit out of that guy and kills him. Then he picks up Brenda, and then so he picked up Brenda, and then he like raised her like his own daughter for all this time, and it looks like they might have fucked at some point because they have like a moment. Which dope. And at that point, he heads off to Rachel's place, and she's getting all gussied up, but she's also like hiding a gun. And then there's like a police cruiser outside that like a what do you call it? The an unmarked car, and it's and then so when Connor comes in, she like goes to the kitchen to like do woman stuff. It's fucking great. And he looks around, he finds the gun almost immediately, and then he looks out, sees the car, he finds like a recording device by the radio, and he shouts into it about something just kind of innocuous. And then she comes out, and they talk for a little bit, and then he calls her out on her shit, and he's like, I brought you a gift. He's like flirting with her a little bit, and then he's like, I brought you a gift. After she lies to him about like what she does for a living, not telling him that she's a police lady. And so she opens the gift, and it's her book, and she's like, what is this? And he's like, you lied to me, you bitch. And he gives her like and he's like, what are you gonna do, shoot me? Like, are you gonna call your little buddies up from downstairs? And she's like, how'd you know? And he's like, not cool, she's not Brenda, not cool, Rachel, not cool. And then he meanders out of there. So after Connor wanders off from his date, we get an excellent Queen song about being immortal. And then we get like the whole life of Connor and his girlfriend, Heather. I think that's her name. He keeps calling her Blossom as like a nickname, so I think Heather is the name. Anyway, so his like girlfriend wife who got raped by Krugen. So we see she apparently never tells him. We find that kind of more out later, but then she brings him back to the house, or the castle is completely destroyed, but that's okay. They just have like a good life together. They like have fun, and we get like a montage of them just like living their life and having a good time and being in love and all that good stuff. And eventually she gets old, and then she dies, and it's super sad-eponymous and whatnot. And so we get like over talk about Ramirez being like, you should leave her, but he doesn't. So he loves her and only loves her through, I don't know. It's assumed that he never finds love again. And there's some indications that this Brenda chick, in the present, the meteorologist, that he kind of feels a way about her, possibly because she reminds him of Heather. Heather is 100 times more attractive than Brenda, to be completely honest, for a white woman. But that's neither here nor there. Following on that, we switch over to the Krugen in the modern day, and he is just pissed off and something. And well, no, before that, actually, we get Connor, and he meets up with like his homeboy, which is this guy who looks like he's from Africa, and that's not just because he's black. It's because he has like the fancy African stuff that, like, especially in the 80s with like that one with Eddie Murphy where he's like a prince in some African country and he comes to America, like that really colorful kind of fancy looking thing with his kufi and whatnot. Like, and they hug it out and they talk about some duel that McLeod. They're like, "What did we be?" Like, "Oh, we met in like this time period." And it's like, "What were you doing?" "Oh, I was drunk having a duel with some asshole because I made fun of his wife or something." And they're like, "Oh yeah." And then we get like a funny scene of him just being drunk and fighting in this duel and losing constantly because he's wasted. It's the guy just keeps stabbing him and he keeps getting up. And finally he like apologizes and wanders off. And then the guy like takes a gun out and shoots like his second for some reason, and I was just like, the fuck is this scene? Excellent times. Okay, so then we switch over to Krugen, and he is, he goes and like he beats up like the motel owner guy who's like jaw jacking him or whatnot, and then he drives off and he meets up with our homie here, who's also an immortal, that the one that Connor met with, the African guy. And then he fights and kills him. And then this homie like shows up, this vet, this Vietnam vet, comes up with like a machine gun and just like lays into him and is like, got him. And all these people are like watching because there's like a sword fight and then there's like a gun down, and they're just like interested in all the crazy shit that's going on. And then the guy gets up, stabs him, throws him, and then the quickening thing happens where he gets like lightninged or whatever, and then he goes over and like cuts the top off this fucking car and tosses like this old man off, and then drives off. And then we get like, oh, the police, and the police they're like, oh, there's no witnesses, no one saw shit, yada yada yada, that kind of thing, right? But then they have the Marine vet who's in the hospital because he survived being stabbed in the stomach with a sword, so good for him. And so they ask him about it, and they're like, is this him? And they show him a picture of Connor, and he's like, no, it's not him. It's the guy with the scar on his neck and all this stuff. And then he's like, all right, we'll get someone to come look at you later. And the guy like laughs and talks about, hey, if you're going to fight this guy, you need hand grenades and shotguns and everything. And ha 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 ha. And that's pretty much the last we see of the police. We see some newspapers that are like Headless Horseman or whatever, 1, Police 0 or whatever, or Headhunter, that's what they call him. We then get some scenes of Brenda, I think is her name, doing some more investigation. She meets with she does all this stuff to find out that like Nash, like the place that was owned, or so she finds like Nash actually died in birth, and so the guy who she's speaking to says he's Nash, not actually Nash, and then she goes to like a handwriting expert, and they like compare the handwriting of the people who've owned like the antique shop, and it's the same handwriting for like 300 years or whatever, and she's like, that's impossible. We then go to a church because one of the things Heather made Connor promise is that on her birthday every year he would like light a candle because she's super Catholic, which is a Catholic thing to do. So he goes and lights a candle for her, and then Krugen shows up, and because it's sacred ground they can't fight, but they jaw jack with each other. And Krugen, this is where Connor finds out that Krugen raped Heather, and then he's super pissed off about that. But Krugen's not going to fight him yet for some reason, even though he's like the strongest one, and there's only 2 of them left. There's only 2 immortals, and you may wonder at this point. Wait, isn't there a whole entire media franchise that includes like 2 TV series, a cartoon, like 7 more movies? The fuck? And you're like, yes, there is. We'll get to that eventually. Because Highlander was not meant to be a media franchise. It was meant to be a standalone movie that like you saw it and it was like, that was badass and it's the 80s and it's great and then it's over. That is not what happened. Anyway, so Brenda confronts Nash / Connor at the place, and then Connor like takes her down to his like secret chamber with all his like ancient artifacts, and then he tells her essentially that he's immortal and can't die and whatever, and then he has her stab him and is like, I'm Connor McLeod for the Cloud of Cloud, which is badass, and then they fuck on the roof at night, and it's like very sensual and sexy and whatnot. And then they're like hanging out at a zoo, and essentially she says like, most people are afraid to die, you're afraid to live, which is true. And then they like separate, and on her way home she runs into Krugen, oh no, and then he like kidnaps her, drives her around, and we have this crazy scene where he's just like laughing and crashing into stuff in a car, like driving people off the road, and she's like screaming. And then he gets a message, like a voicemail, that is like, I have your woman, If you want her back, you got to come find me. And this is where we get to the ending, which the ending is where Connor goes to fight Krugen, and he fights, and he's about to lose. And then Rachel, Brenda. Oh, before he leaves, he tells Rachel, who's the girl he like raised, like he left everything to her, and she's like, even if you win, you're not coming back. And he like gives her a hug and tells her he loves her, and then says something in German, and then he leaves. And so then we head off to so then the battle, fight, and he's about to get his head cut off because he lost his weapon and everything. And that's when Brenda runs up and like hits at Krugen with like a steel pipe or something. And so that distracts him so that Connor's able to get his sword, and we have some more badass sword fighting with like a katana versus like a claymore essentially. And then eventually Connor wins, of course, and cuts off the head. And then like we see all these like the crazy lightning and the blowing up the windows, and we see like demon lightning creatures like going into Connor, and he's like floating in the air, and it's like yep, it's fucking awesome. And then he like finishes up, and she runs up, and she's like, "Are you okay?" And he's like, "Yeah." And then we see like the Highlands of Scotland, and then they have some over talk about how like how do you feel? And he's like, I can hear everything. I feel in touch with everything. I know everyone's thoughts. And she's like, you know my thoughts? And he's like, teehee. And, and then I guess now that he's like the only one, he's the last immortal alive, he can like officially have like kids and stuff, maybe, is what it implies. And then he remembers like Ramirez telling him, and he gets some flashbacks of Ramirez telling him about being immortal and about the quickening and about being the one, and how like essentially he can solve all these problems that he has like forever and all this stuff. And that's the end of the fucking movie. And you're like, awesome. And like I said, it's like, well, you saw this movie and you're like, that was great. And then like little do you realize like 20 years later, there'd be like, like, how do you follow up on this? And the direct sequel to this, as in the movie, the second Highlander movie, is like whack a fucking do. But it's essentially one of the last pieces of this media franchise chronologically. So we're going to get there like much later. But next week we got another movie. I think there's one movie before we get into like the long running series, which is like 6 seasons. And that has like an offshoot series, which is like 2 or 3 seasons before we get back into the movies again. But that's Highlander. It's fucking awesome. I highly recommended going and watching it, finding it somewhere. It is so fun and so good. And so it's just like, it moves so fast. It's like 2 hours, but it like flies by in like glorious fun and good stuff. But yeah, that's Highlander. So go ahead, like, share, subscribe, comment, and I'll catch you guys later. Bye.